All right, so if you haven't been paying too much attention to Reddit lately, there's something I want to show you, and it's very interesting, and it kind of gives you a little bit of insight into what happens or what's happening in the community. With just a little bit over 600 upvotes and 116 comments in just a couple of days, there's been a Reddit thread that's been tearing through the community lately, and it's basically an alarm bell for what's happening in the industry. While we call this peak fiction when a character drops, we meme about Oda and Gege like they're some masterclass titans, then absolutely nothing can happen to them. Here's the actual truth. These titans that bring us peak fiction, they're falling, and they're falling fast. While we're sitting in our houses, comfortable, eating popcorn or drinking soda from our couches, from the luxury of our homes, and we argue over power scaling and mid-art style, these people, these individuals drawing these worlds and giving us the dopamine hit that we look for on a daily basis, they're literally falling and collapsing in hospital rooms. In the last year alone, we've seen the weekly model, a system that has stood for decades, finally start to buckle under its own weight. From the historic shift in the One Piece anime to the controversial end of Chainsaw Man Part 2, the curtain is being pulled back, and today we're basically here to discuss that. We're looking at the math, the money, and the cost these people pay, the price they pay for our enjoyment. This is the truth that the manga industry knows that nobody wants to talk about. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna try to paint you a picture and see if you can see it how I see it, if that makes sense. So we need to think about the mangaka's body like a high-performance PC. A PC that's being overworked without a cooling system, like we're taking the cooling system out. So here are the system requirements. To produce a modern top-tier manga chapter, you're not just drawing, you're basically processing a lot of information in a small amount of time. Most people look at a 7-day week and think that's a substantial amount of time. But let's look at the work to rest ratio. A standard 19-page chapter is the benchmark. If we calculate the density of those pages, it'll be 19 pages times 4.5 panels, which is approximately 85 unique illustrations. In a 168-hour work week, if you spend just 2 hours on each panel, from rough sketch to final ink and backgrounds, that is 170 hours of work. But hold on, I still got a little bit more. There are only 168 hours in a week. Mathematically, you're already 2 hours in debt before you even slept, eaten, or spoken to another human being. To make this functional, mangakas have to do what's, basically a downsample in their lives. They compress their sleep into a 3 to 4 hour window, usually on a couch in the studio, which, leads to what I call a biological thermal throttling. When you sit in a chair for 16 to 18 hours a day, your body isn't just tired, it's actually degrading. First, we have what, everybody should know is spinal compression. The constant hunching over a tablet or a paper leads to chronic nerve damage. This is why Yoshido, the creator of Hunter x Hunter, has famously spent years unable to sit in a chair, having to draw while laying on his back, because his back's all blown out from sitting and hunching over the entire time. Next, we have the infamous carpal tunnel syndrome and tendonitis. If you got those, those aren't good for you. The input and output lag of the human hand, I'm still using, PC terms, by the way. If you're drawing 85 panels a week, you're making tens of thousands of precise microstrokes. And last but certainly not least, I just started stuttering there for a second, we got visual fatigue. Staring at a screen or a high contrast paper under LED studio lights for 100+ hours a week leads to a 40% increase in ocular strain and permanent vision degradation. That's it. And this is just a small portion of what these people have to go through, just so that we can enjoy the characters we love till this day. Now I'm going to try to dabble into a little bit of audio terms for you, just for a little creativity. So in audio terms, this is like trying to run a massive Pro Tools session with 500 plugins on a laptop from 2012. You're gonna get a bunch of pops and clicks, and eventually the entire computer is just gonna crash. When an author has 0% headroom in their schedule, they can't buffer any mistakes. If they get a common code, the entire pipeline for the next 3 weeks is ruined. There's no dwell time for the creative brain to process these ideas. You are essentially asking a CPU to run at 100 degrees Celsius for 20 years straight and being surprised when the motherboard actually melts. But you know, this is the part that gets me about the industry and what liars they actually are. You know, the industry sells us this starving artist aesthetic. You know, they want us to believe that the pain is a part of the art. When we see Oda's desk covered in empty cans of coffee and cigarette ash, and the community says, you know, the community just basically says, you know, look at that, wow, that's dedication. Like, yes, he's the GOAT. Like, no, that's not dedication. That's, you know, that's a man killing himself off for our enjoyment. You know, eventually he is, you know, I won't wish that on him, but you know, eventually he is gonna break down bad. You know, we've romanticized the work culture so badly that it's essentially it's like looking at a slow motion car crash. We're watching creators sacrifice their 50s and their 60s just so that we can have a new chapter to read on a bus ride to school or something, or to work. It's like playing a guitar with a wound G-string that's so tight and sharp that it's about to snap and take your eyes out for sure. It's like the tension is there, and yes, you know, maybe the note is sharp, it sounds good, but at what cost? Like, the math doesn't lie. The weekly model isn't a standard, it's an expiration date. But you know, I'm saying all of that, and it's like, you know, I remember a time when we used to think that, you know, a lot of these authors were solo warriors and that absolutely nothing could happen to them. But then, you know, 2025 came around the corner and it basically changed my perception of that forever. You know, we heard that during the final stretch of Jujutsu Kaisen, Gege Akutami's health was not looking good whatsoever. It took this man Oda, the man who's been basically working his ass off for 20-hour days for 27 years, to step in and personally guide Gege to the hospital just so that he doesn't croak before he reaches the finish line and finishes his work. Like, when the king of the grind is telling his juniors, I'll find you a doctor, you know, the obsession of overworking has to die. Like, it has to stop. At some point, you got to look at yourself and be like, nah, you know, I can't keep doing this. Like, even Oda himself finally hit the wall, you know, what, to the point where so much, it's me stuttering. So it's so much to the point where in early 2026, One Piece came out and said that they're hitting a 3-month production hiatus, you know, followed by a permanent shift to a seasonal format. And it's only 26 episodes a year. You know, when the most consistent weekly engine in history finally admits that quality is no longer sustainable at this speed, you know, it's a problem. Like, why are we still expecting new artists to run until they break and, you know, just basically kill themselves? So to understand why the mangaka can't just take a break, we have to first understand the equity split. So in the West, if you create a hit show, you often own a massive chunk of it. In Japan, the production committee, the Seisaku Linkai model, was designed to spread the risk if an anime flops, so no single company loses everything. But the trade-off is a nightmare for the creator itself. The committee is usually composed of 5 to 7 different corporations. First is the publisher. They want the manga to sell magazines in volumes. Then it's the toy manufacturing companies, like Bandai or Good Smile. They have a factory that schedules set to 18 months in advance. Then we have the TV station. They have a slot that costs millions to maintain. And then, you know, obviously the game companies and whatnot, the game developers, they have their gacha banners scheduled for, you know, a specific holiday or whatever. So, you know, what's the signal source? What's the problem? Think of the mangaka as a preamp. I'm going back to, you know, music stuff, sound stuff. Think of the mangaka as the preamp in the massive signal chain. So if the preamp stops, every single output, the toys, the games, the TV slots, they go silent. If the mangaka like Gege Akutami or Ichiro Oda takes a month-long hiatus, it doesn't just delay the book, it creates a collateral revenue gap. So it's like total loss equals revenue, ad revenue, plus manufacturing downtime, plus missed game DAUs. When the committee sees that equation, they don't see the third person, which is, you know, the artist in this case. They see the bottleneck. They apply the gain to the signal chain, pushing the author to work through the clipping, you know, all that feedback and all that noise you don't want. That's what I'm talking about. So that's when the burnout comes in, because you're forcing this dude to work and work and work, not taking any breaks. That's when you start to see slip up in the actual artistry. Because if the manga moves to a bi-weekly schedule, then the hype cycle frequency drops, you know, and then we have to talk about the licensing and the royalty gap. So here's the part that's actually broken. Most mangakas don't get a percentage of the anime's success. They get a fixed licensing fee. So, you know, look at it like this. So the committee collects billions from the streaming and merch, while the mangaka gets a flat fee, often surprisingly low. And I looked this up, you know, research, often surprisingly low, like around 1,000 to 2,000 per episode, plus their standard manga royalties. So check this out. So you're telling me that the author is working, busting their asses for 100 hours a week to fuel $1 billion machine that they don't even fully own. Think about that for a second. Then they're the source of the signal. They're literally the human that's feeding bread to the pigeons. The committee's the one that gives them permission to feed the pigeons. You know, I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, I'm just I'm just rolling with it right now. Like, this is why we call it a trap. The author is incentivized by passion and duty, while the committee is incentivized by quarterly earnings reports. And you know, I'm saying all of that, everything in regards to the, you know, the production committee and all that garbage, you know, and this is where we start to get the fast food, you know, the fast food of anime, the fast food manga and stuff like that. When the committee prioritizes schedule over signal or schedule over quality, the quality starts to actually get distorted. We've seen it in, you know, part 2 of Chainsaw Man, you know, and we saw it in the final chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen. The lines get thinner, the backgrounds disappear, and the soul of the art starts to look like a placeholder. You know, they don't have a soul, they don't have any substance. But we as fans complain that the art fell off, and we start yapping on these social medias. But we're looking at the wrong culprit. Like, we're looking at the wrong person. We're blaming the guitarist for a bad solo when the sound engineer is pushing the faders so high the speakers are literally on fire, and you just start to hear a bunch of scratching. There's, you know, I'm stuttering again, which I'm probably gonna put up a meme every time I stutter, you know, just to make it a little bit funny or whatever. Like, the committee wants a product that is good enough to sell a figurine, not a masterpiece that takes 3 weeks to draw. They don't want that. They want their money. They're trying to get to that bread. So they're basically trading the author's legacy for a 2026 fiscal year win. So check this out. Tatsuki Fujimoto is the perfect example of what happens when a genius creator or a good creator meets an industrial schedule. And even the fans are a part of the problem. So if you want to see the exact moment the weekly manga model breaks, you don't look at a bad manga, you look at Chainsaw Man. So in March 2026, when part 2 finally wrapped up and finished, you know, the discourse was poisonous. Like, it was bad. Like, people weren't just talking about the story, they were obsessed with the line quality. If you look at the signal to noise ratio, you know, back to some more music stuff, sound stuff, we saw a measurable shift. So part 1, which was 2018 to 2020, we had heavy hatching, high contrast inks, and assistant heavy background. Then, you know, obviously in part 2, 2022 to 2026, we got, this is where we got the, you know, the decline or whatever, the decline in quality or whatever. You know, we got thinner lines, digital shortcuts, you know, and a focus on cinematic framing over illustrative detail. You know, the paradox here is that we expect the creator to maintain masterclass quality while we're adding more complex problems to the mix. You know, we're giving them more work, and they can only do so much. You know, during the height of part 2, Fujimoto wasn't just a mangaka. He was, you know, 1, lead writer and artist, you know, for the weekly drops. 2, He was a creative consultant for the Look Back and the Goodbye Eri film adaptations. Thirdly, he was the project supervisor for the Mappa anime continuation. I'm stuttering again, so that means probably gonna go up. So basically in audio terms, if you're running a session in your DAW with too many plugins, you're gonna start to hear latency and pops in the manga. I don't know if that's making sense. Just write it in the comments. Let me know if it's making sense to you or not. That latency manifests itself as simplified character designs. That's where you start to get wonky looking characters. Fujimoto just isn't getting lazy. Well, it's not that he's getting lazy. He realized that to finish the story without ending up in the hospital, like Gege Akutami did, he had to reduce the rendering time of every panel, which i.e. means he had to scale back on the quality just so that he can push it out fast enough, and not take long enough, because if you wanted to do it good, you take longer. Quality takes time. And here's the unbiased take that not a lot of people like to hear. We're the ones holding the whip and flogging these dudes every single day. Like, we've basically become digital Karens. Like, we want the cinematic genius of a Goodbye Eri, the emotional gut punch of a Chainsaw Man, and we want it delivered to our phones every Tuesday at 12 p.m. like a DoorDash order. And when Fujimoto gives us a chapter that is even slightly sketched because he spent his entire week making sure that the Look Back Eri movie didn't suck, we call it a fall off. Fujimoto's Part 2 art style wasn't a mistake, it was more of a survival tactic. He chose to give us a complete avant-garde story rather than a beautiful unfinished corpse. If we keep gatekeeping the quality based on how many lines are in a character's hair, we're gonna run out of good creators in this industry until what we have left is that garbage that looks perfect, looks good, but says absolutely nothing because there's just no soul behind it. So in manga, the dwell time per page has dropped down to roughly 40% ever since the early 2000s because of this pressure from the production committee we talked about earlier. When you look at the Chainsaw Man paradox, you're looking at a creator who is manually trying to bypass the system. Fujimoto is essentially saying, I will give you the genius, the layouts, and the story, but I refuse to die for shading. The question isn't why the art changed. The question is, why are we so entitled that we think that his health is a fair trade for a prettier drawing? It's just whack, man. There I go stuttering again, but to heck with it, bro. I'm just gonna leave it in. You can make fun of me if you want. I don't really care, let's laugh about it. Like, I'm even mellowed out now. Like, I was super hyped throughout the video, but it's like, nah, like, just thinking about it sucks. Because time and time again, we see people all over the internet complain and trash talk a specific anime. Like, people complaining about the art style in One Piece. It's like, come on, y'all. Like, really? Are we actually complaining about the art style? It's not bad. The weekly era is dying. It has to be. It's about time. Between Togashi's 2026 April update reminding us that he can barely sit in a damn chair, the industry is finally evolving. It's changing, but only because it was forced to, not because it had to. So what's the solution? We have to be okay with a bi-weekly chapter release. We have to be okay with seasons that take 2 years to produce, and we have to stop calling it lazy and start calling it longevity. After seeing what happened to JJK and Chainsaw Man, would you support your favorite series going bi-weekly if it meant the author actually lived to tell the tale?